Hello. Today I'm going to do the chapter on stratification. And so you need to print out the handout that's posted in the chapter on Moodle. And it says Chapter 9, Social Stratification Worksheet. And again, depending on the edition of the book, it could be Chapter 9 or Chapter 10, for example, but just look for the title Stratification. Now, stratification, as it says at the top of the paper, is a system by which society ranks categories of people in a hierarchy, which means somebody's at the top and somebody's at the bottom. And you can rank people in all different ways. You can rank them according to nationality or race or ethnicity or religion or sexuality or gender or money, which is a very important part of our economy, obviously. So the thing is this: we have a ranking system in our country. It's how we look at things. It's how we decide things. And if you notice on your paper, it says that this ranking has 4 properties. Number 1, it's found in every society, but it's different from society, from culture to culture. So what might be important in one culture, like having a lot of money, may not be giving you a higher ranking in another culture. So you have to know that culture and what they value. But everybody's got it, but everybody's different. And you're born into it. The family you're born into has a certain ranking or status within that society, and you are judged by that depending on the standards within your society. So for example, if you are born a female in a society that doesn't value women, well, you're kind of stuck with that until you're older and you can make those changes to bring that status level up, for example. It all depends on what your culture values. It could be value boys over girls, one religion over another, but you're born into a certain grouping, and so that may determine some of the opportunities or the obstacles that present themselves in your life, and we're going to see about that. And then the 4th thing is that it involves a belief system, that you are not even aware that you have grown up with this system in the American culture, for example, because it's simply a part of who we are, and it's pretty much ingrained into our system. And so if you are an American and you live the American culture, you automatically sort of believe in stratification, unless you're somebody within one of those minority groups or lesser groups that may look around and say, well, I don't like how I'm being treated, or this isn't fair, and then you might be advocating for change. Someone at the top who's in the greater majority may look around and say, well, I don't think it's fair that I have these advantages and privileges, and so therefore I am going to work to make this more fair. So it all depends on where you are, what you're born into, what your culture believes, and how you adapt to that during your life in your culture. Now, typically when we look at a culture, we'll see 2 different types of systems. One is a caste system, and a caste system is one that you're born into. And you essentially, it's a very rigid system. You cannot change. And if you think of what you know about old India, for example, that was a very rigid caste system. What you were born into, you died in that as well, unless you completely left the culture. And that way, this is the only way you could pretty much break free. Many historians believe that slavery was a form of a caste culture in this country for many, many, many years because of the hardships and the horrible life that it prescribed for certain citizens in the United States. The other type of a system is called a class system. That's what we have here in the United States. And a class system is one that has mobility. You can move up or you can move down, depending on maybe what you do or maybe winning the lottery. It is very much a movable kind of placement. And you can do it 2 ways. You can have a system where it's achieved, which means you earn it. So the fact that you are in school right now means that you are achieving a higher status by having a career path, doing better for your family, making more money for your family, for example. And so an achieved status is very important to us here in America. The other one is ascribed. And ascribed means that you're born into it or you inherit it. So if you are a Hispanic female, you have been born into that ascribed status. If you are a prince, you might someday become a king. So you're either born into it or you inherit that new status that you acquire as time goes on. Now, a meritocracy means that you get ahead by your hard work, your merits, and we believe in that in the United States. We see ourselves as a meritocracy, for example. Now, a functionalist would say that everything in society is there for you so that you can achieve and do well, whereas a conflict theorist would say, no, not everybody starts out in the same place, and as a result, some people struggle and have a lot more obstacles to overcome in order to do well. So we're going to see how meritocracy ties into the American dream and whether or not you believe it is still something that's functioning even today. And then status constancy is something you can read about in your textbook in terms of, think of it as being in a constant status in terms of your placement in society, and that you carry it with you. Now, your book talks about what it's like in England, Russia, China, and other places in terms of how they have their stratification, because again, every culture has it. Then what happens in your book is you come to these schools of sociology, and here we're going to see the functionalists. And of course, the structural functionalists are the guys who say, if you find something in a society, then it must exist for a reason. And they don't judge good, bad, right, or wrong. They simply say, well, if you find poverty, it must exist for a reason. If you find crime, it must exist for a reason. And we're going to see that as we go along, obviously, through the book. We've already seen it in the deviance chapter, for example. Now, the two famous guys who have a theory in the functionalist area are the Davis-Moore theory. And they believe that social stratification has beneficial consequences for the operation of society. And so their argument is this, that the brightest and the best have to get higher rewards in a society in order to do the hard work. So if we want you to become a doctor and you go to college for 4 years, medical school, maybe you go on for residency for 3 years, well, that's like, 10, 11 years of your life that you're investing. And then when you graduate, we expect you to have the sickest of the sick, take on the hardest cases possible, go through a pandemic, for example. And so it's reasonable that we're going to ask the brightest and the best who are going to make this sacrifice of going to school and taking on a tough career, that they're going to get more rewards. So they're going to get, in our society, higher levels of money, status, and power. And so that's what they're going to get as a way to encourage them. Now, Davis and Moore say, look, we also need garbage people. Somebody's got to pick up the garbage. And so we need someone, they're necessary to society, but you only need maybe a high school diploma and some training in hazardous waste. And we're going to give you a lovely truck. And we're going to pay you a little bit more than the street sweeper, but we're certainly not going to pay you what a doctor gets. And so they maintain that stratification has to happen in a society because one group, has a bigger investment and we really need them, and the other group is still providing good service for society, but you don't need as much training. And so they maintain that stratification is inevitable. It's going to happen. There you go. And so that's how they establish their theory. Now, of course, the conflict theorists with criticisms by Marx, they're going to look at this and say, what? Say who? Who said that has to happen that way? And so the problem that you have here is that they maintain that that doctor has certain privileges and opportunities that they can bestow upon their children that maybe a garbage man can't give his kids or her kids. So as a result, the playing field stays unfair just by virtue of where you start out. Now, that's not to say that the child of a garbage person can't get to medical school, but they would maintain that there are more obstacles and more hurdles to get over to get to that quality education, to pay those bills, to have those same advantages. And so, they both have their way of looking at stratification. One says it's inevitable, the other one says it's sort of a power grab, and they pass it on as they go along. Now, part of what the conflict theorists, as you see on your sheet, say, that there are capitalists, the people who own and run the factories and businesses in the pursuit of profit, versus the proletarians, the people who sell the labor of their wages. Remember, Karl Marx is the guy who says that you sell the labor of your hands in order to get that salary, so you're at the mercy, essentially, of that boss. Now, he said that essentially he prescribed that there would be class conflict, that the people at the bottom would wise up and then rise up and overthrow the people at the top and have a revolution. And as you see on your paper, I gave you a list of, why this didn't happen, ultimately, this revolution, because Karl Marx didn't live long enough to see that we would have, a very fragmented middle class. We'd have a higher standard of living over time for the most part. There would be more labor unions and programs and laws that would help to protect workers, child workers, and adult workers. He never saw the rising middle class and the rise of middle management that did better. So it created another whole class of individuals. And then in your book, you're going to see that it talks about Max Weber, and that W is pronounced as a V, and he's a very famous fellow. And you'll see there that he's the one who talks a lot about money, status, and power, that those are three very important things in a society. So I know that you can read that. And then if you turn to page 2, turn it over, we've got stratification and interaction. Now, at the top of this page, what you have is income. Now, income is the money that you make on your job, and you might get some dividends, from your, say, an investment of some kind. But income is what people make, and most people in this country, over 60%, live from paycheck to paycheck and are literally 2 paychecks away from being out on the street, which is part of what makes this current pandemic so serious, because so many people at the bottom of the service sector, because we are predominantly a service sector economy, they're the ones who are going to lose their jobs first, and as a result, they have no backstop in order to help them, pay their rent or pay for their groceries and take care of their families. So they are at much higher risk, which is why Congress has tried to pass these bailout programs to try to assist people so that they can be protected and keep their home and keep the lights on and keep a roof over their head until the economy becomes more stable after we get a handle on this virus. Now, wealth is going to have a formula. It's going to be income plus your assets, but minus your debt. Because you have your money coming in. Wealth is going to be measured by, say, if you have a home or a car or insurance or retirement funds or whatever it may be, savings. So income plus your assets, put those together, and then you subtract what it is you owe. And for many Americans, realistically, they owe a lot, and they may owe them more than what they have. And many Americans do not have wealth. They have not accumulated wealth. They don't have a house with an investment made, or maybe they haven't paid off their car. And so as a result, we find that wealth is fairly concentrated in a smaller segment of society. And for many rich people, wealth is passed down from generation to generation to generation. So realistically, they're doing okay. They can live on those investments and the money they make from those. And so in your book, they have some wonderful graphs there talking about how if you divide the economy and the population into the top 20, next 20, middle 20, next 20, and the lowest 20, that when you divide like a magic dollar at the end of the week, and you find that the top group walks away with most of the dollar, or a good part of the dollar. If you're looking at wealth and you divide the country into 5 people who represent those layers, and you have a magic dollar and you pass out wealth, well, you find out that those people at the top walk away with most of the wealth in this country, which means they're going to have most of the money, status, and power, and the clout to get what they need from the government or from the legislators to have power and influence. And so that distribution of wealth, I want you to take a really good look at that in the chapter, because it's pretty impressive. And there's also a bar graph in there. A couple pages after you see those 2 circular pie charts, there's one where the graph lines go up, and it shows over a 20-year period of people at the bottom 20%, then the next, then the middle, then the upper middle, and then the middle. And if you look at that graph carefully, what you'll see is that for most of the first 4 lines, they have not changed very significantly over the last 20 plus years. In fact, the people in poverty are making less than they did back when that survey started, like in 1980. Now, that's not the same poor people, but people who are in that category of poverty. And remember, these are government figures. These are not something that the book has made up. But if you look at that top line and you see how amazing it has been for that top group to go up and up and up, well, that certainly is pretty devastating when they're making so much more in that same period of time. Now, a functionalist would look at that chart and say, well, of course they're making more. They make the most investment. They take risks. They run businesses. They deserve all the money that they make. Now, a conflict theorist, after they had a heart attack looking at that graph, would say, wait a minute, those people at the top are keeping all those profits for themselves. And even if they, came down a little bit and distributed some of that wealth to the lower levels, we'd still find that they would have a tremendous amount of money. And they would argue that the people at the top are exploiting all those other lines down at the bottom because they are paying those wages and they know that those people are poor and are taking advantage of their position in society. And so take a really good look in this chapter at the graphs, at the pictures, whatever, because even if you just look at the picture of it, it really gives you this kind of stark realization of how money is distributed in terms of our overall society. Now, on your paper, it talks about how wealth and income do affect things like power, occupational prestige, and schooling. We know that people who have higher occupational levels in terms of how we look at them in society tend to make more money, have more status, again, have more power, and they have advantages in terms of getting technology, better diet, nutrition, opportunities for rest and relaxation. They have what we call social capital, that they have skill sets and talents and experience that they can rely on and fall back on, or just use their knowledge and their language skills and what have you. So they're in a pretty good place. We know that people with more money usually have opportunities for better education for themselves and their kids, better health care, for example. And so all of those things keep ratcheting up someone's advantages in society versus somebody else. Now, I will be posting a diagram for you, which has a chart on it, and it looks like this. You can hopefully see that a little bit. But this is a really, really famous chart that was done by a woman who got the idea that people look at society in different ways depending on their class. And so the story about Ruby Payne is that she's a psychologist. She met her husband in graduate school. They get married. He doesn't have any family to come to their wedding out on the West Coast. And so as they begin married life, she notices that he's really cheap. I mean, really, really cheap. And she can't understand why. So she confronts him, and he says, look, I come from a very poor background, and, you used it up and you wore it out, and that's how it was, because I lived in a ghetto in Connecticut in this a city called Hartford. And so she's like, it can't be that bad. So they travel back to Connecticut so he can show her where he grew up. And as she goes through this neighborhood, she realizes that he did grow up in extreme poverty and that the way he looks at the world is very different than how a middle class or upper class person would look at it. So, for example, she comes away realizing that if she does a study on how different groups of people look at the same item, that would give people insight how to work with a client or a customer, because she's involved with psychology, obviously, and human services. So, for example, in her research, she finds that in terms of food, for example, for a poor person, the key question is there enough food? Will there be enough to get through the month? A middle-class person looks at food and says, does it taste good? Whereas a rich person would look at food as something exquisite, very desirable, made with, really elite kinds of ingredients that the rest of us would never have access to. And so it's more of its presentation. And if you've ever seen restaurant shows on the Food Channel and there's a really ritzy restaurant, it's always these little teeny weeny servings that are very artistic. Whereas middle class and lower class, we'd be hitting the buffet because we could get more bang for our buck. And so something like food is treated differently. Things like education are treated differently. Poor people admire an education and want that to happen. But realistically, you may have to work so hard to put food on the table that they can't get to those opportunities for education. Whereas a middle-class person sees education as crucial for climbing the ladder of success and for making money. And for the rich, yes, education is important, but it's also about tradition and making the right connections and having your child be at the right schools so that they hang out with other rich kids. Even if they're not very bright, they might still be able to get in. And so it's something where her whole value system, and there's a whole sheet, and I'll post it for you there, is really pretty amazing when you think about how you look at stuff, whether you're living on a street and you talk more of a street language versus a middle class English language level, which is what you learn in English 111, 112. When I used to have to testify in court, I would always use my 25-cent words because I wanted to impress the jury and the judge and the lawyers that I sounded like I was smart and knew what I was talking about. because that would get me more respect and more regard and give me more validity in the court. And so even things like language and how you use it can make a difference in terms of how you may come across. But again, it depends on the culture that you're talking to and dealing with. Other contributing factors are ancestry, race and ethnicity, and gender. And in our society, which is a patriarchal society, we know that women do not always have the same money status and power as men. We've made a lot of gains, but we still have a way to go, ladies. We're going to see that in an upcoming chapter. And in terms of ancestry, some people complain that, minority kids get a break getting into college. Well, the actual statistics show that kids have more of a break with ancestry. If your parents went there or a grandparent went to that school, that actually increases the likelihood that you'll get admitted to that college. So it's a far more reliable statistic than using any kind of race or ethnicity. And when we get to the chapter on race and ethnicity, we'll see how that factors in terms of social stratification. Now, the next thing on your sheet is about socioeconomic levels, and you'll see that the upper, middle, and lower and underclass are listed there. And the upper is divided into two parts, the upper and the lower upper. The middle class is divided into the upper, middle, and lower class. And then you have a lower class and an underclass. And in your book, they describe each of these groups. And remember that the upper class, depending on the statistics you look at, is about 5% of the population. But of the uppers, that's about 1% in terms of that 5%, only 1% of it, and the other 4% are the lower uppers. Now, the uppers are old money, blue bloods, ancestry, people who practically had relatives come over on the Mayflower. The lower uppers are going to be people who are going to be what we call nouveau riche. These are people who've come into money through celebrity, winning lottery, dot-com businesses, whatever, and they're often considered a little more gauche or a little more tacky, that they don't have the same level of acceptance as the people in the upper level. And the uppers are often much more private about their lives, hang out only within their own social group, obviously. Now, somebody like a Bill Gates is actually technically a lower upper because he was not born into his money. But he's very highly regarded by the uppers because he has put his money into the World Health Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He has done a lot to restore historical artifacts from Michelangelo, museums, art stuff. So he's done a lot of really, really good things. So he's very highly respected and is not perceived as somebody who's just kind of garish and brazen about the money that he has. The middle class is divided into upper, middle, and lower. And again, the numbers for how you qualify in this group differ a little bit depending on the research you're looking at. But most people fall into the middle, and lower middle in the United States, realistically. And that lower middle group is also called the working class. And so these are people that used to be called blue collar and pink collar because they worked in factories and had blue shirts. Pink collar meant hotel workers and women working as waitresses in diners, for example. And you'll be seeing those divisions in your textbooks. You don't need me to redefine them for you. But what we do know is that middle part is shrinking. And more people are dipping. And now, thanks to this whole new pandemic, more people will be dropping into that middle, and then the lower middle because they will be without jobs and resources. And then below them is the lower class, and the lower class are going to be the working poor. And please understand that people who are part of the working poor work very, very hard at labor-intensive, back-breaking jobs that nobody else wants and nobody else will take, and they work very, very hard for very poor wages, often part-time, cobbled-together jobs with no sick time. Over 50% of workers in this state of North Carolina do not have sick time, which is why it was so important to get that coverage put into the very first bills that Congress just passed as a way to try to help people who are sick from the virus. But the lower class people are the backbone of the economy to a great extent. And without them in the service industry, we would be lost. Now, the lower class is very poor, so they're under usually $20,000 a year. But below them is the underclass. And the underclass are the people who are at the very bottom of society, kind of scraping the bottom. And so these are going to be people who may have substance abuse problems, have been incarcerated, mental health problems, personality disorders, just can't get along with other people. These are people who may often be illegal immigrants who are working in sweatshops, being taken advantage of, field workers, for example. And so the people at this bottom part are very, very poor, often very unskilled. not able to kind of make it in society, and as a result we need to find a way to help them to have at least minimal resources so they can at least survive. And this does include a certain number of elderly and women with children, of course, in both the lower and the underclass. So we need to think about what's happening to those kids and their lives. Now below that I put some examples of median income, and remember there's mean, median, and mode. Mean is the average, median is where you take all the salaries all the way across and you cut it right in the middle. And so I have the median income for New York, North Carolina, and North Dakota, whether you're one earner or a two-person family, just to give you an idea of the differences. So in New York State, for example, the median income is $56,000, whereas North Carolina it's $47,000, and North Dakota it's $52,000. So it's just to give you an idea of some of the differences. And then I've also posted for you on the next page information about the census and median household incomes overall that you can go to. And I gave you the information for the 2018 national median family income. It was $61,937, but in North Carolina it was $53,855, and that was the most current statistics I could find for you. I also posted there how race is a factor, and that median income for all families is $61,937, as I said, but for white families it's $65,900. For white non-Hispanic it's $67,900. For African American families it's $41,500. For Asian families, $87,200, and for Hispanic families, $51,400. So what it tells us, just from looking at those raw numbers, is that realistically, white non-Hispanic are making, and Asians are making the most money in terms of that median income in this country, and that African Americans are lagging very, very far behind. Now that's not to say there aren't many African American families that are doing extremely well, but it just says that somehow there is tremendous inequity in the system, and we as sociologists want to understand why is there such a disparity in those numbers? What's going on that it would be so low and even lower than the average Hispanic family amount as well? And then I also posted, does age make a difference? Well, people under 25 have a median income of $33,000. The next group from 25 to 44 is $68,000. 45 to 64 is $75,000. And then over 65 is $44,900. And again, this shows how people, as they go up in their career and become more successful, are typically going to be making more money, and so it's tilted that way. And then when you retire, you are now on a fixed income, and things drop. But that's still very high because most retirees do not make that much money. And if it weren't for Social Security, many older citizens would be in dire poverty. Social Security is what helps to keep them afloat, as it were. Then your book talks a little bit about what difference a class makes, and this talks about social mobility. I know you can read about that. It's about intragenerational and intergenerational, and it talks about the changes in trends, race, ethnicity, gender, marriage, and divorce. And so this is about movement within your lifetime or movement as compared to your family. And so you can read about both of those. And again, your author talks about the American dream, and here he's saying again that the functionalists would say, hey, things are fine, right? Whereas the conflict theorists would say, no, the American dream is something that is kind of stacked against you. It's going to be very, very hard to get ahead. And so it all depends on where you stand and what your theoretical belief system is. We hope this is a country where people can succeed and achieve, and if you watch Shark Tank and you watch people bring their businesses forward that are creative and innovative, that's great, but that's a very small percentage, obviously, of the population. Now, what I'm going to do is stop here so that you get a rest. It's 28 minutes. And then I'm going to post a second part to this about poverty that's going to be shorter. And after that, I'm going to post a lecture on stratification on a global level, globalization. And then after that, I'm going to post one on gender stratification. And again, this is all from the handout that I've posted that hopefully you're going to run off. So let me stop this here, and I'll be back to posting some more in just a few minutes. Thank you for your time and attention, and hopefully this all made some sense and helped you look at the class outline. Again, use your book, use your other materials that I've posted for you and the films that I've posted, and hopefully it's a good experience for you. Thank you. Bye-bye.